You feel the cold marble beneath your bare feet. Each step echoes through the atrium, carrying you away from everything familiar. The torches cast shadows that twist and writhe across the walls, and somewhere behind you, voices murmur words you cannot understand. Your heart pounds so hard you wonder if the witnesses can hear it. This is the moment they promised would make you a wife. But no one told you what that transformation would actually cost. And honestly, it amazes me that stories like this reach people everywhere. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. There's something profound about how history connects us all, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. It was the spring of 92 CE, during the reign of Emperor Domitian. 17-year-old Aurelia stood at the threshold of her husband's home, her saffron veil glowing in the lamplight. She had been prepared for this day since childhood, taught to walk with grace, to manage a household, to honor her family's name. The marriage contract had been signed 3 months earlier. The dowry transferred. The auguries declared favorable. Everything about the ceremony had followed tradition precisely. 6 witnesses from respected families. A priest invoking Juno's blessing. The joining of hands before the household altar. Yet as Aurelia crossed into the inner chambers, she felt the atmosphere shift from celebration to something else entirely. Something the wedding songs and flower petals had carefully concealed. The atrium was arranged like a stage. Oil lamps burned in copper holders, their flames steady and bright, positioned to illuminate rather than create privacy. In the corner stood a figure covered by heavy cloth. 7 people waited in silence, not friends, but functionaries of a ritual Aurelia had never been told about in detail. The pronuba, an older woman whose role was to guide brides through the sacred rites, stepped forward. Her face showed neither warmth nor cruelty, only the calm certainty of someone who had witnessed this scene countless times before. Behind her, a physician adjusted his leather satchel, his presence more unsettling than comforting. And near the doorway, Aurelia's new husband Marcus stood watching, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back. For the first time, Aurelia understood that the public ceremony had been a performance. This was the real wedding, the part that mattered to Roman law, the part that would transform her legally, physically, irrevocably, from girl to wife. Roman marriage was never about romance. It was a contract that transferred a woman from her father's authority patriar potestas to her husband's control. The law called it conventio in manum, the passage into the hand. But what Aurelia hadn't known, what no one had explained clearly, was how literal that passage would be. The pronuba's voice cut through the silence. The rites must be completed as our ancestors ordained. Each step serves the gods and the state. Each step has been performed for centuries without interruption. Aurelia's mother had embraced her that morning with tears in her eyes. Not the tender tears of a woman watching her daughter grow up, but something deeper, something that tasted of old wounds. She had whispered only one instruction: do not resist. No matter what happens tonight, do not resist. Now, standing in the lamplight with strangers watching her every movement, Aurelia began to understand what her mother had meant. The pronuba gestured toward the covered figure in the corner. You must first greet Mutinous Tuatunus, the god who opens the way for married women. He blesses what is to come. The name was vaguely familiar, whispered in fragments, always followed by silence. Mutinous Tuatunus, the deity of conjugal beginnings, so uncomfortable for polite Roman society that his worship happened only in private chambers. Yet despite that discomfort, he was considered essential. Without his blessing, the marriage could not be completed according to tradition. Aurelia moved toward the covered shape. Her hands trembled as she reached for the cloth. When she pulled it aside, she understood immediately why no one spoke of this god in daylight. The wooden statue stood upright, carved with deliberate exaggeration. Its form was unmistakable, designed not for decoration, but for function. The message was brutally clear. This was an instrument of preparation, a tool to condition the bride for what marriage demanded. You must approach him as supplicant, the Pronuba explained, her tone shifting to something almost motherly, which made everything worse. You must show submission to receive his blessing. Ancient writers would later struggle to describe this ritual without outright condemnation. St. Augustine called it an obscenity that made a mockery of sacred marriage. Arnobius hinted that brides were brought before the symbol under watchful eyes. Varro, trying to remain neutral, used language so vague it revealed more through omission than description. Modern scholars sometimes soften the reality, calling it symbolic, a harmless custom, nothing more than sitting on the god's lap. But the ancient sources don't support that gentle interpretation. They spoke of submission, of initiation, of preparation. The weight of what they didn't say hangs heavier than any explicit detail. For Aurelia, none of the theological debates mattered. She knew only that she was standing before this carved figure with 7 pairs of eyes watching, waiting for her to comply with instructions she could barely comprehend. The Pronuba's hands were firm as she guided Aurelia's movements. Not violent, but absolutely certain. There was a choreography to this, steps that had been repeated for so many generations that they had become mechanical. The bride must be prepared, the woman murmured. The body must learn what marriage requires. This was the truth beneath. Roman marriage, a woman's first lesson in wifely duty, came not from her husband, but from a ritual designed to strip away any sense of bodily autonomy before the wedding night even began. The witnesses remained perfectly still. Their faces showed no emotion, no discomfort, no compassion. They were not there to feel. They were there to confirm that tradition had been followed, that the rites had been completed correctly, that if questions arose later about the marriage's legitimacy, they could testify. Aurelia felt something crack inside her. Not physical pain, but the sudden collapse of every assumption she had held about what her life would be. She had imagined marriage as partnership, as building a household together. Instead, she discovered it was training in obedience. Minutes stretched into something endless. The lamps burned steady. The physician watched with clinical detachment. Marcus remained near the doorway, his discomfort obvious, but his silence absolute. He too was trapped in a role he hadn't chosen, performing masculinity according to Rome's exacting standards. When the ritual with mutinous Tutinus finally concluded, the enslaved women stepped forward with bowls of perfumed water. They washed Aurelia carefully, methodically, their touch neither tender nor harsh. This was called purification, but it felt more like preparation for the next stage. Because the night was far from over, the physician approached for his first examination. In the Roman world, a bride's body was treated like a living document, something to be inspected and verified before the contract could be sealed. This wasn't about health or carrot, was about legal certainty. An earlier examination had already been performed before the wedding, documented in writing as evidence that Aurelia met the marriage agreement's terms. Now, after the encounter with the wooden god, the physician would conduct a second examination to compare her condition, to confirm that the ritual had achieved its intended effect. Aurelia instinctively tried to step back, but there was nowhere to go. The Pronuba's hand on her shoulder was gentle but immovable. The witnesses adjusted their positions slightly. Their attention focused not on Aurelia as a person, but on Aurelia as legal proof. The physician's hands moved with practiced efficiency. He examined, compared, documented with the detached precision of someone reading a contract. For him, this was routine work. For Aurelia, it was the moment she understood that her body no longer belonged entirely to her. She tried to retreat inward, to find some corner of her mind that remained private. But even that felt impossible under the bright scrutiny of the lamps and the silent observation of strangers. When the physician finally stepped back and nodded to the Pronuba, it was simply confirmation that the process could continue. No warmth, no acknowledgement of what this might feel like, just the cold mechanics of Roman law in action. The chamber prepared for the consummation had been arranged long before Aurelia arrived. She had imagined something private, intimate. Instead, she entered a room designed for observation. The bed stood in clear view of the open doorway. The lamps were positioned deliberately so no shadow could hide what was meant to be witnessed. The pronuba took her position at the entrance, a guardian of ritual order. The witnesses remained just beyond the threshold, not inside, but close enough to see and hear everything necessary. By custom, the door had to remain open all night. This was the clearest declaration of all. Roman marriage did not begin in privacy. It began under the gaze of others, verified and confirmed by those whose testimony would make it legally binding. Marcus entered after a long pause. His anxiety was obvious, not the nervousness of a groom uncertain about intimacy, but the tension of someone who knew he was being measured. His performance wasn't about affection. It was about fulfilling a duty, proving his capability, satisfying the expectations of witnesses who would judge whether he had properly claimed his wife. The pronuba spoke with ritual gravity. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed this union. Let the consummation proceed according to the laws of Rome and the customs passed down through generations. Let the witnesses confirm the fulfillment of the rite. What followed was not union, it was compliance. Marcus moved stiffly, burdened by the same pressure that weighed on Aurelia. Whatever human compassion he might possess had been buried beneath the performance demanded of him. In another time, another place, he might have spoken gently. Tonight, he was as trapped as she was. Time became impossible to measure. The open doorway allowed every sound to drift into the corridor. The witnesses listened. The pronuba occasionally offered brief, formulaic corrections, as though following a manual passed down for centuries. Aurelia's mind pulled away from her body, searching for distance, for any escape from the physical reality of what was happening. She felt herself split, one self enduring the ritual, another self floating somewhere above it, watching from a place where none of this could touch her. There was no room for tenderness, no space for intimacy, only process. When the pronuba finally spoke again, declaring that the consummation had been sufficient for legal purposes, Marcus stepped back immediately, exhaling as though freed from a burden. He didn't know what to say. Any gesture toward comfort would have violated the rigid formality that governed the room. Then the physician returned. His presence marked the ritual's final stage. He examined Aurelia once more with the same clinical precision, checking, comparing, documenting. This was the moment that mattered most to Roman law, the physical confirmation that the marriage had been consummated, that the contract was fulfilled, that Aurelia had been transformed from daughter to wife. When he finished, he gave a small nod. That simple gesture completed Aurelia's legal transformation. She was no longer under her father's authority. She was now part of Marcus's household, subject to his control. Her body verified and documented as the property the marriage contract had promised. In the flickering lamplight, Aurelia felt the full weight of what her mother had tried to warn her about. Not physical pain, though that was present, but the deeper wound of understanding that her body had been witnessed, evaluated, catalogued by strangers. That her will, her desires, her sense of self had been irrelevant from the start. The night ended, but the silence it planted would last decades. With dawn still distant, something larger than Aurelia's individual experience was taking shape. The ritual she had endured was just one piece of a system that had governed Roman womanhood for centuries, a system that would eventually be dismantled, condemned, and nearly erased from collective memory. We know fragments of what happened that night, only because history leaves traces even when people try to bury them. Scholars reconstruct these rituals, like archaeologists piecing together shattered pottery. Using scattered legal references, uncomfortable medical notes, and most tellingly, the outraged condemnations of early Christian writers. Ironically, the people who wanted these rituals forgotten were the ones who preserved the clearest evidence of their existence. When Christianity spread through the empire with its radical ideas, privacy, the intrinsic dignity of the body, marriage as sacred union rather than transaction, it clashed violently with Roman custom. Christian thinkers denounced everything about rituals like Aurelia's. For them, marriage consummated under watchful eyes was obscene. A wooden god presiding over a bride's first night was blasphemous. Medical examinations felt like violations, not of tradition, but of morality itself. Rome could not hold both worlds at once, so the empire began to forget. Statues of mutinous Teutonus were removed, smashed, or buried beneath floors that wouldn't be uncovered for centuries. Manuscripts grew mysteriously incomplete. Wedding frescoes in noble houses were painted over. What had been law quietly faded into silence. But forgetting doesn't erase the echo. Legal texts mentioned indecorous ancient customs without naming them. Moral treatises warned of humiliations once forced upon brides. Symbols in the catacombs hinted at a deep desire to distance new beliefs from an uncomfortable legacy. Eventually, the Roman wedding became idealized. Saffron veils, joyful songs, walnuts thrown for luck, elegant processions, those were safe to remember. The rest was pushed into shadow, creating the comfortable myth we often encounter. The graceful, poetic, romantic Roman wedding. A myth made possible not by ignorance, but by deliberate silence. Yet beneath that silence lies a truth too significant to ignore. Aurelia, resting in the dim room as the oil lamps flickered out, knew nothing of how the future would rewrite her experience. She didn't know it would be smoothed over, polished, erased. But her silence, like the silence of countless Roman women, became the foundation of that forgetting. She lived according to expectation. She managed her household with efficiency. She attended religious rites with proper devotion. She bore 5 children who would never know what her first night had truly been. She carried the dignity of a matron, the serenity expected of her class, the obedience demanded by Roman society. But she never spoke of that night. Not to friends, not to her mother, not even to her daughters when their own weddings approached. Not out of shame, not out of protection, but because there were no words the world would allow her to speak. Her silence was the language Roman women had been forced to inherit. Historians try to fill that silence with theories, reconstructing practices from legal fragments and architectural clues. But the questions that matter most remain unanswerable. What did Aurelia think as she approached the covered statue? What did she feel during the physician's examinations? What exact moment inside that long night changed her forever? And how did she manage to continue living for 43 more years without letting that fracture define her entirely? We know what was done. We may never fully grasp what was felt. Aurelia died around the year 135 CE at 60 years old, leaving behind a prosperous family and a life that seemed from the outside perfectly aligned with Rome's ideals. No inscription recorded her thoughts. No tablet mentioned her wedding night. Her story dissolved into the daily rhythm of an empire that preferred certain truths remain unspoken. Yet if we lean close to the cracks in history, we can still hear something faint to whisper, a reminder, an echo of a life shaped by rituals the world later chose to forget. The marble floor where she walked that night still exists somewhere. Buried beneath modern Rome, the room where witnesses stood has long since crumbled. The oil lamps that lit her transformation were melted down centuries ago for new purposes. But the silence remains. And in that silence, we find not just Aurelia's story, but the story of every woman whose experience was deemed too uncomfortable for history to preserve, whose voice was considered less important than the smooth narrative of civilization's progress. By remembering her now, even imperfectly, we break a small piece of the silence Rome tried so carefully to preserve. We acknowledge that behind every sanitized version of history lies a human. Caustrial people who live through moments we would rather not imagine, whose dignity demands that we look directly at what was done to them. Not through the comfortable lens of ancient custom, but through the clear-eyed recognition of what those customs actually meant. The night Aurelia feared most didn't end with dawn. It echoed through every day that followed. a ghost that walked beside her through markets and temples and family gatherings, invisible to everyone else, but always present. And though Rome eventually buried the ritual that created that ghost, the echo remains, waiting for anyone willing to listen closely enough to hear it.